Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to US Modernist Radio. Join host George Smart and Frank King as they talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. Show your support by reviewing us at iTunes and by visiting US Modernist Massive Archives at usmodernist.org. And now, fresh off the boat, America's only modernist comedian, just back from yet another round-the-world cruise, Frank King. Got your sea legs gone or back or whatever it is?
Land legs, Tom, is what you get when you get back. That's the order of events,
Got it. So the room's not rocking so much now?
No. Of course, I live in Oregon, and recreational weed is available. So, it's speaking of events, every year Palm Springs has a huge event called Shark Week, and our own George Smart. Oh, I'm sorry.
It's in the desert.
That's a land shark. Every year, Palm Springs has a huge event called Modernism Week, and our own George Smart was there talking and drinking, by the way, with the keynote speakers from what is essentially a 10-day martini party in amazing residential architecture. Today, we join George at the Hotel Skylark, talking with architecture author Alan Hess, who you've definitely seen in design documentaries, and Janice Lyle, director at what has become the unofficial Western White House, the Sunnylands Center and Gardens in Palm Desert, California. Support for US Modernist Radio comes from Moho Realty. Are you having a hard time finding or selling a modernist home? I've got the answer for you. Sarah Sonk of Moho Realty, bless her heart. Is a real estate agent who gets modern like you do. She loves these great houses and has the expertise, experience, and track record to close your deal. You can find her at www.mohorealty.com or 919-601-7339. Give her a shout. And by US Modernist Masters Gallery. Say that 5 times fast.
Ooh, that sounds fancy.
Featuring profiles on every modernist house by nearly every major 20th century architect. Yep, I know what you're thinking. We couldn't care less about the 19th century architects. All the Wrights, all the Schindlers, all the Neutrers, all the Lautners, over 5,000, from Alto to Zenitos. Warning, this website is as highly addicted as porn. We cannot be responsible. It is sort of porn for architecture fans, isn't it?
I wouldn't know.
We cannot be held responsible if you stay up all night and miss work the next day because of our website. So go ahead and dive in at your own risk. www.usmodernist.org.
This is George Smart with US Modernist Radio, and we are poolside at the Hotel Skylark in Palm Springs, California. My guest this afternoon is Alan Hess, journalist, historian, and architect, focusing on projects in architectural preservation. He has written 19 books specifically addressing mid-century modernism, but more importantly, he is the Samuel L. Jackson of architecture documentaries. Almost every documentary you've ever seen in the last 10 years has featured Alan Hess. So welcome, Alan.
Thank you, George. Good to be here.
Did you know you were the Samuel L. Jackson of architecture?
I'd never heard it put that way before, but okay, I'll take it.
How many have you been in?
I don't know. I haven't kept count. I know I've written 19 books, but I haven't kept track, and they keep coming along. And there's several that are, in production now that I've done, but they haven't come out. I don't know. Probably under 20. Under 20, I would say.
Okay, well, that's still a lot.
Yeah. Well, on Neon, on Palm Springs, on individual architects, on cities like Palm Springs. So,
I think you were in Captor's documentary and Cody.
Right.
And Wexler.
Yep. And Bill Kreisel. And then Desert Utopia, which was about all of the Palm Springs
all those guys.
People. Yeah.
We always see you looking very pensive by a fireplace or something, talking about architecture. With the living room in the background.
They like that's my house.
That is your house,
and,
okay.
They seem to like it. The light's good, so they use that.
So let's start out, since you're a superhero, let's start out with your origin story. So how did you fall into your interest in architecture and then later preservation of it?
Well, I do have to give a lot of credit to childhood influence. I think architecture communicates to everyone, even children, and it certainly influenced me. And growing up, I was born in Pasadena, growing up in Southern California, we went to especially these California coffee shops. Bob's Big Boys, Van de Kamp's, and others.
The Googie style?
Much later I learned it was
Okay.
the Googie style, but at the time I had no idea. It was just cool restaurant. Yeah, and it imprinted an image in my head about architecture and space and landscaping, plants and cars and all those sorts of things. So it was only many years later when I went to architecture school that I began to realize that it was a type, it was a thing, and then started writing about it.
Now, I believe you're one of the few architects who also went to journalism school, right?
No, I didn't go to journalism school, though I did have a journalism fellowship at Columbia for a year, because I have been writing for the San Jose Mercury News, many journals. I've written a lot of books, so they had a good, it was a National Arts Journalism program to take a year off to study whatever you wanted to do at Columbia University, which was great.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So what kind of things did you write on during that year?
I wrote about World's Fairs.
Oh, yes.
And the Ferris wheel. And how, the Ferris wheel, when you think about it in context, it was, of course, built for the 1893 Chicago Exposition. And the last great World's Fair monument had been the Eiffel Tower, which was also of steel. And what they did in Chicago is they took the Eiffel Tower and they made it move. They made it rotate. I mean, it was just, in the times, it was just an incredible thing. Such an example of American ingenuity and industry and making this entire huge building. It was much larger than any Ferris wheels we see today at a county fair or anything.
Oh, really? It was a big thing.
It was enormous. Yeah, it had cabs on it, not just little two-seater things, but cabs that held something like 30 or 40 people, like the size of a train car, basically.
Oh, so like the Millennium Wheel in London is today, more that size.
Closer to that.
Yeah.
But this was 1893.
Holy cow, I didn't know that.
Yeah. So World's Fairs and World Fair architecture and the creation of imaginary environments. The midways, the first midway was at Chicago then, and that is a whole route of amusement parks, theme parks, eventually Disneyland, this architecture of entertainment that came out of World's Fairs, basically. So that's one thing I was studying.
Now, let's get back to architecture. So since mid-century modernism had pretty much died by 1970, when did you see it start to come back? When did you see the renaissance of this start to get back into people's consciousness?
Yeah, well, I dated to 1984 when Ship's Coffee Shop in Westwood closed and was demolished. And there was a group of people in Los Angeles, this was, of course, and we realized, hey, these things that we have always known and loved and thought would be there, they're going, and we don't even know anything about them. So that was really the start. I mean, out of that, for example, came the Modern Committee of the Los Angeles Conservancy, which was devoted specifically to saving modern buildings. And none of that stuff was thought to be important or good architecture. I mean, one of my favorite anecdotes is that after my book on Googie came out, and this was 85 or 86, I was on a panel for the Los Angeles Conservancy on modern architecture. It was one of the earliest, public forums for that. And I was in distinguished company. John Lautner, a great architect, was there. Whitney Smith, another great architect, and John Blanton, who had worked closely with Richard Neutra, was there. And they were talking about their work, and then I was talking about coffee shops. And in the question and answer period afterwards, front and center, like second row, Julius Shulman, the great architectural photographer, and one of the legends of 20th century, mid-century Los Angeles. He stood up and very pointedly directed at me. He said, "How can you talk about these ugly coffee shops, compared to the work of the great John Lautner and Whitney Smith and Richard Neutra?" So I was publicly berated by Julius Shulman for having any interest in these simple, vernacular, commercial buildings. Now, I have to say, in fairness to Julius, that later I became friends with him, and he admitted to me that, he loved those commercial buildings. He photographed them all the time. He had an incredible catalog of those in his archives. But at that time, he did not think they were important, and that was generally accepted about those buildings.
And for the next 10 years or so, they continue to come down, right?
Oh, yeah, they're still coming down.
Is the one with the big donut still there?
That is still there.
Okay.
But, there are a couple of those around, but the best-known one is Randy's Donuts, which is near LAX.
All right. That's the one I've seen in lots of movies and TV shows and things like that.
Yes.
So how did you get geared up in terms of writing books about the specific architects and the movement of mid-century modernism?
Well, I was in architecture school at UCLA, and there were a series of small books that were coming out about commercial architecture, vernacular architecture, gas stations, the White Castle chain, and those inspired me. I wanted to write one of those. It was a small book, so it was simple to do, I thought. And so I was looking for a subject, and then I kind of stumbled upon this one of these California coffee shops in Googie style.
And when did you do your first book about a specific person, an architect?
That was probably my book on John Lautner, which I think was 1999.
So he had been dead 5 years or so by then?
Yeah.
Okay.
I really wanted to... I felt like I needed to wait until he was gone. He had his own book that he created, and I didn't want to step on that. So that did come out before he died, and that was his statement of his work. And then after that, I felt that I was free to do my own research and write.
And when did Lautner kind of come back into public awareness? It seemed like that after his death, it was a quiet time, and then all of a sudden everyone's looking at Lautner houses.
I would say that was sometime in the last 10, 12 years or so. I think it was I can't remember, it was 2013. There was an exhibit and a symposium about Lautner specifically at the Hammer Museum here in LA. So frankly, I didn't think even at that point that most of the people kind of got Lautner. He's such an amazing architect who just pushed every boundary, which is why he was ignored in his day. People didn't get him.
No.
They thought he was just doing these wild, spacey sorts of things. But in fact, everything he did had a reason, as astonishing as the ultimate form of them was.
We were in the Sheets Goldstein house on Tuesday, and one of the things that people commented on was that it just was so much bigger than any photograph or video could convey. Standing in that main room with the sweeping triangles above you, looking out above the city, you just don't get that scale.
Yeah.
And I guess a lot of people look at a weird modernist house from the outside and don't get to go inside and don't get the scale. I understand here in Palm Springs, the Elrod house is very similar, is that it's gigantic on the inside. But you don't detect that when you're watching Diamonds Are Forever, or watching Sean Connery go through and get beat up by the two henchmen. Bambi and Thumper, yes.
Yes. Well, Lautner started with the interior space. He was shaping space, and the walls, whether they were concrete or glass or wood, were his medium for shaping that sense of space, livable space, habitable space, and so forth. So that was the most important thing to him, was space, not structure.
As John Lautner's reputation grew posthumously, did people find out about it through your books, through television, through their realtors in the LA area? I mean, it seemed like, to me as an outside observer who wasn't even much into this at the time, that somewhere around 2000 or so, everybody was talking about Lautner houses and Neutra houses. That was the big thing that I would read in the New York Times or on the LA Times. How did that come about in your view?
I'm not quite sure I understand. How did the awareness of Lautner come about?
Yeah, the sort of huge posthumous reputation.
Yeah. Partly it's a commercial thing, especially realtors found that they could sell a house better if it was by Lautner or if it was Lautner-esque.
Yes.
As well. That gave some attention to them. Certainly, and realtors have picked up on that and really play on that. The newspapers, also the media. I mean, Lautner houses, of course, photograph amazingly,
beautifully.
And so magazines and other papers have played off of that, the photographs, because they're eye-catching. And then he's was a newer name, and they want to play off of, an undiscovered or, rare master, whatever. So that's where a lot of the popular, I think, awareness, at least of the Lautner name. And then right here in Palm Springs, or last Friday, they unveiled the star on the Walk of Fame for John Lautner, which is really a nice local recognition of him. So those are all good parts of it.
Now, sadly, almost all of these guys are gone.
Mm-hmm.
There are just a very few that are still alive.
Yeah.
Who do you see coming as the next wave of really exciting architecture?
In terms of historic architects rediscovered?
Well, in terms of the sort of the modernist style carried into the next 40 years. I mean, who's turning out things now that we're going to look back and be preserving 50 years from now?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and it has to do with Palm Springs and Palm Springs Modernism Week, because this isn't just a historic era that people are nostalgic about, but designers of all sorts, architects as well as product designers, tech designers, are really interested in the concept of mid-century modern. And it's one reason why they come here to Palm Springs to learn, to see the original things. So, in fact, the spirit and the concept of mid-century modern is alive and well in many of these younger, cutting-edge designers building and designing products for today. I've just realized that especially this week in talking to a number of people. So I think the spirit, and what is the spirit? It's a spirit of not just of practicality or functionality, but also of taking that a notch up. I mean, you take somebody like here in the desert, like Don Wexler, who designed the steel houses and many other houses. He was kind of in his soul an engineer, solving problems, and that's how he saw himself. But he wasn't. He was more than that. He brought this artistic element into it that make his buildings so special. So it's things like that, I think, that designers today are really interested in.
In Europe, people like Bjarke Ingels are heralded as the next great thing coming, and I was just wondering if you see any Americans on the horizon for that.
Well, I don't. Yes, there are some. However, I have to bring this back to the history.
Yes.
Our heritage of modernism. For example, Diller, Scofidio, and Renfro.
Okay.
Very well-known, successful architecture firm based in New York right now. They just completed last year the Broad Museum on Bunker Hill in Los Angeles. And it's a private collection, and it is the structure covered in precast concrete sunscreens that are very shapely, kind of carved out. It's an interesting thing, but repeated.
This is Eli Broad?
Eli Broad's collection.
Yeah.
And when I first saw the renderings of this, I thought, gee, that's Edward Durrell Stone from 1965 and the Perpetual Savings Bank in Beverly Hills. And so you go back to that and you see that architects back then were dealing with these unusual concave geometries as repeated concrete precast elements to create the whole exterior of a building. William Pereira, another example. I live in Irvine, and the University of California at Irvine, opened in 1965 by William Pereira, also has these precast concrete sculpted sunscreens that are repeated and create the exterior of the building. So what's new with Dillard, Scofidio, Renfro? Not that much. I think it's important, and you mentioned Bjarke Ingels as well. His buildings, Rem Koolhaas's buildings, also refer back to this period in time. Specifically, I think the 1960s and even the 1970s.
Okay. Now, what's your next project? Your book or movie?
Yeah, a book right at the moment that I've been working on for a couple of years. It is a history of California modern architecture from 1900 to 1975.
Okay.
And this has never been done. California certainly has had many books on its architects and architecture, but they've been localized. It's been Northern California architecture or Southern California architecture or Richard Neutra or John Lautner or specific people like that. Nobody has ever looked at California as a whole in this very creative period, most of the 20th century. So my co-author and I, Pierluigi Serrano, saw that there was a need for it. So that's what we're doing.
So who were some of the very earliest architects in, say, 1900 that were doing exciting things in California?
Yeah, there were a lot. Out here in California, architects around 1900 felt free to experiment. And they had these new materials, concrete, glass, steel, industrial materials, to experiment with. And so people like Bernard Maybeck and Ernest Coxhead in the San Francisco Bay Area.
Green and Green, would they be in that group?
Green and Green in Southern California. These are often called arts and crafts architects, but I call them modern because they were creating something which was completely untraditional, completely different than classical architecture. And they were using new materials. Bernard Maybeck's Christian Science Church in Berkeley, for example. It's a church, very respectable sort of architecture, but he made it out of concrete and steel sash industrial windows like you would find in a factory. And yet out of that, he created, again, took it a notch up and created this remarkable, spiritually, centered space. Also, Irving Gill in San Diego, using concrete, new concrete construction methods, but combined with his knowledge of history, the Spanish mission history of California, and combining those to create a new architecture. And really none of that has been given all the credit for it. One of the myths that I keep hearing repeated by people who should know better is that modernism was introduced into California in the 1920s by Europeans, people coming over from the Bauhaus or Germany or whatever. The historic record simply does not.
It was already here. Yes.
It was already here in the work of Maybeck, the Green brothers, Gill, Frank Lloyd Wright, Frank Lloyd Wright's son, and many others.
Well, Alan, thank you so much for coming by and talking with us. When is your book due out?
It'll be out at the beginning of 2018.
Okay, so next year. You can read Alan's books at your local bookstore or on Amazon.com or other booksellers, and its website is alanhess.net. That's ALANHESS.net. Thanks, Alan.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Okay, guys, stay with us. There's more with Sunnylands Center and Gardens Director Janice Lyle coming right up.
And hello, I'm George Smart with US Modernist Radio, and we are now poolside at the Hotel Skylark in Palm Springs, California, sipping something with vodka in it, which is the perfect place to be talking with Dr. Janice Lyle, who is the current director of operations for Sunnylands Center and Gardens, and is also the former director of the Palm Springs Museum of Art, as well as an author of the book Sunnylands, America's Mid-Century Masterpiece. And if that's not enough, the thing I found most interesting about her is that she used to live in the Albert Fry house here in town, which if you haven't come and seen it, is just unbelievable. How was that?
Well, that's a life-changing experience. It's one of those opportunities to somehow change the way you view the space that surrounds you. So for 2.5 years, my husband and I lived in that little glass box with the big boulder in the middle of the bedroom on the hillside above Palm Springs. And the original house was 750 square feet. Albert Frey did add a 250 square foot addition later, and we could impact that a little bit, but otherwise it was a historic house that was being preserved. We could have nothing of our own. We were living as Albert had designed and furnished that house, and every aspect of it had been thought through. Because it's a glass box on the hill, you looked out over the city below and onto the mountains on the side. Yes, the views were unbelievable, and you got a sense of the solitude and actually the benefits of living simply and just letting nature engage directly with you, or just taking in the sounds of the wind against the hills, and nothing impeded that kind of direct connection.
So most Americans know Frank Lloyd Wright, but in Europe, Le Corbusier was the man over there.
Yes.
And Frey studied with him, right?
Correct. Actually, Albert Frey worked with Le Corbusier in the late 1920s and before he came to America. So he was influenced by Le Corbusier, influenced by the international style. And but when he came to the desert, there was a shift, as there seems always to be with architects when they realize they're going to respond to a different environment entirely.
Yes.
And so the house I lived in is called Frey House 2. It was the second house he designed for himself in the desert. The first one was actually on the desert floor, and again was a very simple box-like type structure. But later in his life, it was a simple box-like structure that he then added to elements that are often referred to as the spaceship component, where it had these round windows on a second story. And then he decided to build on the mountains. He said, I've lived on the desert floor. I now want a different view of the desert.
Yes. Now, I understand that old Albert would occasionally walk around in the nude, and you really couldn't see him from up there. Did you ever try?
That's not the story.
That's not the story?
No, Albert certainly was unconventional in a number of ways, and he loved yoga. There are photos of him standing on his head. Later in life, he really practiced yoga into his 90s. And my best memory of him, because I did know him, it was him standing at the entrance to the house at the sliding glass door, dressed all in yellow with his little creamy yellow hat and his yellow outfit. So that's that's the style that I think about in relation to Albert.
Now, you were director of the Palm Springs Museum of Art at the time you were living in the house.
Right.
And the museum controls that house. Is anybody living there now?
Actually, I don't work at the museum any longer, so I can't definitely answer that, but at the moment, I believe no one is living in the house. They are making when Albert decided to bequeath the house to the museum. I met with him and I chatted with him about it, and what he wrote into his document was that it was being left to the museum for the purpose of being open to architects and architectural students. He wanted the house to be available in that way. The museum has expanded that and made it open to the general public in a range of tours that are especially available during Modernism Week, for example. But initially, when the museum inherited the house, no one lived there. And the back room, that addition that wasn't original, was used as an office by one of the curators. And it seemed like that kept some activity at the house, but it didn't infringe on the original section. But actually, after a number of years, a house that's not lived in often feels a little sad, or feels as if it isn't as alive and vibrant. And so at some point, we decided, while I was director at the museum, that my husband and I would go live there as an experiment, see how that worked, and we restored the house in a range of ways. We were very, very sensitive to all the fabrics and furnishings in the house. And then there were others who lived there after we left. It just so happens that right now it doesn't seem someone's living there.
I would have liked to have been at that meeting. You're sitting around the board and thinking about, this house is vacant. It's really kind of sad. Gee, what could we do? Honey, you want to move in? How great is that?
Yes, it was pretty great. A pretty wonderful opportunity. And we actually sold an Alexander house. We had been living in Palm Springs for many years.
Okay.
We owned an Alexander house. We sold it. We sold everything we said that we were not emotionally attached to, and put a few things in storage, and then lived this more minimalist lifestyle.
Now, you are now at Sunnylands, which is a sprawling facility with the main house designed by Quincy Jones, the architect, not the musician.
Right.
I bet you get that question a lot by younger people.
So I try to say, often I will say, it's a Quincy Jones, Archibald Quincy Jones.
And for those of you that don't know, Sunnylands, over the last decade or so, is not just a fine piece of architecture and an estate, which was originated by the Annenberg family, but is now considered to be a retreat for international meetings.
Right.
For very high-level, presidents of countries, right?
Right. Yes. So during the Annenberg's lifetime, 7 American presidents visited. Since the trust inherited the property after the Annenbergs died, President Obama has visited 3 times for official meetings, first with the president of China, Xi Jinping, and then with King Abdullah of Jordan, and then last year with the 10 leaders of the Southeast Asian nations that are called ASEAN. And so they had an official summit at Sunnylands, and the founding documents for managing this property after the Annenberg's residency state that we should be available to the President of the United States for the purpose of facilitating international agreement. And so that's one of the primary goals, is to make this available for diplomacy and connections to the Secretary of State, the Supreme Court justices, bipartisan leadership of Congress.
Does that exist anymore? I didn't know that was a thing.
I don't think it's a thing.
So, does everybody stay there? Like when all the nations come, do they all stay? How many people can stay there at one time?
Right. We actually can house 22 people through accommodations at the house, the main house, which has an extension with 5 historic guest rooms. And we have 3 A. Quincy Jones designed modest houses, which we call cottages. There's a 4-bedroom, a 2-bedroom, and a 6-bedroom house, and so people stay there as well. But actually, for the ASEAN summit, The Southeast Asian leaders did not stay at Sunnylands, and President Obama has a good friend in town, and he's stayed with his friend for that particular event.
Okay. Now, I understand, too, that sort of like Sunnylands is this place for world leaders to go. Doesn't Larry Ellison have some kind of private golf course nearby where they play? Where they play golf?
Larry Ellison does have a private golf course, and sometimes he makes that available to people as well.
Okay. That's a pretty good gig, I would think.
I guess.
Fly into town, stay in this great architecture wonder, and I'm sure you guys have got, like, you know, all the security right and the laser beams at the door, and so I know you can't talk about it, you'd have to kill me, but,
right.
You know, that must be, like, that's an incredible task to have a center you can be secure in.
Well, and that is one of the reasons why Sunnylands, the historic site, which is on 200 acres, is so attractive to the White House and the Secret Service, etc., because they can secure it. It is remote enough from other access areas. We do have adjacent...
That's the police coming for us right now. I think they've heard we're broadcasting here by the pool illegally. Just hang on a moment while this passes by. Okay, now back to our regularly scheduled programming.
Okay. So, adjacent to the historic estate, in 2012, we opened a visitor center and gardens, and that's the public access part of Sunnylands.
Okay.
And so that actually allows, last year we had 93,000 people who came and experienced the story of Sunnylands and programs that highlight the value systems from Sunnylands. But about 20,000 people a year actually visit the house, and that's because we are very careful about the number of people, the impact on the house itself, and we have to balance it between retreats that are occurring at the house and public access.
Oh, sure. So does the house like have meeting rooms and things people can meet in? How does it work?
Actually, in general, the house it remains in the condition that it was when the Annenbergs lived there. So the furniture is all William Haynes furniture. It's placed where William Haynes designed it. There is an art collection that's still in the house. The Annenbergs' big collection of Impressionist and Post-Impressionist paintings actually went to the Metropolitan Museum on Walter's death. But all of the other objects in the house are original. So people who visit have a chance to really experience the house as it was during its time of cultural significance, probably the 1970s and 80s during the Reagan years. But we also do retreats. And when the retreats happen, they occur in one section of the house. And then, of course, when the White House comes, everything can be moved and changed, and it's all there to accommodate the needs.
Now, I've heard a rumor that Donald Trump wants to paint the house gold. Is that true? Can you confirm that for this, Janice? Is it going to be gold?
No, I cannot confirm that.
She cannot confirm or deny.
Right.
Well, thank you very much for coming and joining us. Janice is the author of the book Sunnylands, America's Mid-Century Masterpiece, which I'm staring at now, which looks like a beautiful
coffee
took.
Yes.
And you can pick that up at your local bookstore or on Amazon.com. This is George Smart with US Modernist Radio.
That's another episode. Thanks for listening. US Modernist Radio is underwritten by the Saint Sarah Solk, the real estate agent who loves modernist houses just as much as we do. You can reach the good Saint at 919-601-7339. And by US Modernist Magazine Library, where we're working on collecting and scanning every major U.S. architecture magazine since 1930. It's searchable, downloadable, and the best part, completely free at USModernist.org. All right, take us out, Tomas.
Thanks, Frank. Visit usmodernist.org for more information about today's guest. US Modernist Radio is edited by Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song was performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl. US Modernist Radio is a production of North Carolina Modernist Houses, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guild. Show your support by writing a great review of us on iTunes. George and Frank and I will be back in 2 weeks for another denied, misstated, backtracked, walked back, operationally inactive, alternative trip. Who writes this stuff? Edition of US Modernist Radio.
Oh, priceless.